This is the Meetinghouse with Dwight A. Moody. News, reviews, commentary, and conversation on religion and American life. Now, here is Dr. Moody.
Meetinghouse, I'm glad to be here today, broadcasting from our studio in the western mountains of North Carolina, Hendersonville to be exact. We're broadcasting on the radio out of Brunswick, Georgia, and on the television platform of the St. Stephen's Missionary Baptist Church of Louisville, Kentucky. And you can catch us on my YouTube channel or on the Facebook page of the meetinghouse.net. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. I have 5 news stories today, as I always do, brought to you by Perfecto Coffee. 2 of my students at Georgetown College moved out to California, launched their own company last year, right as the pandemic was starting. And they're our sponsor. You can go to their website, perfectocoffeeinc.com, and order some coffee. I always give a bag of the coffee to all of my guests, and I'm going to do that today with my very special guest, a longtime friend of mine, a scholar, a preacher, an innovator, an influencer, the Reverend Dr. Mark Jefferson. Dr. Jefferson is assistant professor of homiletics. That's an academic word, which means preaching. He's at the Virginia Theological Seminary. It's an Episcopal school just outside of Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Meetinghouse, Mark. This is your first visit to the Meetinghouse.
It is, and I'm so very grateful that you would have me today. It's always good hanging out with a buddy of mine, someone who I can talk preaching with, and someone who I admire tremendously for their tenacity in preaching the gospel. So thank you for having me.
Mark and I got connected back in the early days of the Academy of Preachers that I launched in 2009. He was a doctoral student, PhD student at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and we worked on this project.
Hold on. Wait.
What?
Hold on.
Oh,
we can't.
Okay.
I went to Emory, man. We got.
Emory.
If it wasn't Emory, otherwise I'd have been okay. But no, I went to Candler. I went to Emory.
Okay.
So in Atlanta.
I want you to correct me anytime I'm wrong on this show, Mark. Just jump right in there.
Only about certain things.
We've had a lot of outstanding preachers and scholars come out of Emory, and I'm glad that you're one of them. It's actually one of the very few, as is Vanderbilt, very few PhD programs in homiletics and liturgics and preaching, and you're at the very top of your profession where you are. At the end of the show today, I've got a commentary, and it's called Yes, I'm Woke. Yes, I'm Woke. But before I start in with the news, I want to say this to all of our watchers and listeners. I've been having some health issues. And I'm not going to tell you what they are, but if anybody watching or listening can discern what my issues are, and that may or may not be transparent today on the show, it could be. If you discern it and email me or post on the Facebook page and you are right, I'm going to send you some coffee. I haven't even told Mark Jefferson what's bugging this 71-year-old frame of mine. 2 announcements. Because of these health issues, I'm having to cut back on some of the things that I do. This coming Monday night at 8 o'clock, I teach a Bible study online, but this coming Monday will be the last of the summer. I'm going to suspend it and then make a judgment about whether to relaunch it this fall. And then I want to say I've been planning a live broadcast of the Meetinghouse from Springfield, Illinois, during the Illinois State Fair. in the middle of August, and I'm going to cancel that. One engagement in August that I'm going to keep, the Lord willing, is on Sunday, August the 9th. I am the featured preacher at the 125th anniversary of the Third Baptist Church of Owensboro, Kentucky. This is where I was a pastor for 6 years in the 90s. And as a matter of fact, I was the pastor when we celebrated the centennial, or the 100th anniversary of the church. And I am thrilled to go back, have many, many friends in Owensboro and in the church. And I hope I'm well enough, strong enough, and have the blessing of everybody in my family to make this journey. You all pray for me, will you? Okay, now the news. Now I've asked Mark to provide some running commentary on these news stories. I don't think he knows what the stories are yet, so he's hearing them just as you are. Number one, from Washington, D.C., a research group called Generation Lab polled young people, asking them about critical race theory, what they know about it, what they think about it, their impressions of what they were taught in high school and in college on race. What they found is that while some differences exist between students who identify as Republicans versus Democrats, college students overall are not nearly as worked up about this issue as older Americans appear to be. Almost 70% of these students believe racism is mainly a systemic rather than an individual issue in our country, and an even stronger majority believe that their high schools did not teach enough about race in America. What say ye, Mark?
I say that it's very interesting to watch the evolution of the conversation about critical race theory. It began to percolate in law schools in the 70s, Derek Bell and others, Kimberly Crenshaw, and they were trying to account for the legal framework of how Anglo-American and Anglo power works in the world. If you've never read God and Gold by Walter Mead, you would want to read that, because it talks about how through force and through economic commerce, a particular group of people that we call white were able to take control of the world as we come to understand it. So this furor, quote unquote, about critical race theory in many ways comes from the think tank engine up here where I'm at, passing this information out, because this has been out for, people brought this up. Matter of fact, in 2007, when President-elect Obama was becoming president, and they were trying to drag him into this whole critical race theory with Derek Bell thing back then. So this has been something that's been sitting in particular pockets of political and social thought for a while, but now it's being unfurled because of the ways in which people are having to account for why is the legal system, since this is a legal theory, why is this legal system failing particular groups of people? And if you in the law, the theory is basically saying if you exist outside of this legal framework that is given to you, then the ramifications of that theory are then going to happen to you. So it's an accounting of what is happening, and that accounting doesn't make everybody happy. And
it sure doesn't.
And I think that, and it shouldn't make people happy, because happiness is not the name of the game. Truth is the name of the game.
Truth and justice. I've been very interested in this, Mark. I attended as a journalist the Southern Baptist Convention about 4 weeks ago in Nashville, Tennessee. And CRT, critical race theory, was all over that convention, on the streets, on the floor of the convention, in resolutions and caucuses. It is the new boogeyman of the religious right. I wanted to know something about it. So I picked up a book this week and read it. I'm going to show it to you. It's called Fault Lines: The Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looming Catastrophe. I sent out my review on this in the newsletter last night. It's also posted on my website. This is probably about as good an attack on critical race theory and all social justice movements like Black Lives Matter, as you will find, at least in the popular world, I found it woefully lacking, and I doubt that it converts anybody to anything, but I did read it, and I'm going to read this book that you just referenced. What did you call it? Something in Gold?
God in Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World.
Yeah,
one of the things that I try to bring to the way I teach homiletics is that I majored in political science in undergraduate. So, and I find that angle is underrepresented when we talk about homiletic literature. And so for me, I'm curious about the ways in which these intersections are made tangible in the news and how we interpret those.
And those undergraduate years were at Emory University in Atlanta, right?
Norfolk State University, Norfolk, Virginia.
Oh, really? I'm double wrong.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it, Dwight.
How come I don't have all my facts right? Okay, from Washington, D.C. again, the United States Department of the Interior has announced an initiative to investigate the burial practices at long-closed boarding schools for Native American children. These schools were often run by religious groups. The decision comes after hundreds of unmarked graves of such children were discovered over the last few weeks at similar schools in Canada. That has generated a great deal of anger and destructive actions by unnamed people focused against religious institutions. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition has identified, can you believe, 367, quote, historically assimilative Indian boarding schools that operated in the United States between approximately 1870 and 1970, end quote. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has welcomed the investigation and promised their complete support. You know, Mark, this has kind of come into the public awareness with a fury over the last couple of weeks out of Canada. And we now have the new Secretary of the Interior is herself a Native American woman. And so this got on her desk and she went to work on it. What do you think?
How we remember things tells us the value of what we remember. And so for these indigenous people to be forcibly assimilated, intentionally unaccounted for, and continually perpetually pushed aside by history and forces, number one, ties to the first news cycle, which is there is a particular realm of power that exists. And whenever we try to atomize the occurrences of power, we delude ourselves and assuage ourselves of the responsibility of action. And so when we make it an individual thing, like, oh, I'm not a bad person, well, again, there's structures that superintend our actions. And so when we see how people are remembered or not remembered, it shows you how that system then valued them. And so the question of how we remember people should continue to haunt us in very painful and helpful ways.
You know, Mark, there came across my Facebook feed today a story about the Carlisle, Pennsylvania Indian School. Had a picture of, at least a couple of hundred of these young students. Some of them had to be preschoolers. And of course, the philosophy behind these schools is, well, let's take those young Indians away from their violent and vicious parents and put them in Christian schools, and maybe we will educate all their native wickedness out of them. As a matter of fact, I believe, you correct me again if I'm wrong, that the Carlisle School is where the great Jim Thorpe went to school. Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I'm almost sure that's right, in one of these schools. In Nashville, Tennessee, Lifeway Research, a division of the Southern Baptist Convention, reports that 2/3 of American churches celebrate the 4th of July by incorporating patriotic songs into their worship services. They even list the top 10 songs. 5 of these are established and well-known tunes, including America the Beautiful, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, America, the Star-Spangled Banner, and God of Our Fathers. These are very traditional songs. But another 5 are more recent vintage and may not be as well known. They include God Bless the USA by Lee Greenwood, God Bless America Again by Billy McVeigh. I've never heard of that song. May God Bless America by Weldon Kennedy. I've never heard of that song. A Patriotic Salute by Linda Spivacek. I've never heard of that song. And America by Chris Tomlin. You know, I've just been out of the loop on all this contemporary music. Did you know any of these songs, Mark, except the first 5?
I want to say I knew 3 of the last 5.
Yeah.
In my travels, I've heard different renditions of these songs.
Yeah.
In different places I've been. Yeah.
From Oklahoma City, Hobby Lobby, the billion-dollar retailer of hobby craft and decorative goods, continued its decades-long practice of publishing in holiday newspaper ads all over the country, touting the religious convictions of its corporate owners, the Green family. This year, the ad featured an American flag and the text, "One Nation Under God." It also printed a series of quotes, including one from the Bible and several from national leaders during the years of the nation's founding. This is, of course, now a common effort to demonstrate that the founding fathers of our nation were all Christians and wanted the United States to be a Christian nation, all of that sort of thing. That's been a very controversial stance. And of course, this ad has received considerable reaction, especially from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. You can go to the website of Hobby Lobby and see many of these websites. I mean, many of these ads going back to at least 20 years. And from Washington, D.C. again, the United States Supreme Court has agreed to hear arguments in yet another case about public aid to religious schools. In a case entitled Carson versus Macon, 3 families from 3 different small towns in Maine have filed suit, claiming that local school districts offer school tuition payments for students to attend public and private secondary schools, anyone they want, as long as the schools are not religious. The case features 2 opposing constitutional values. For the state, on the one hand, not to discriminate against religious beliefs and practices, and on the other, for the state to maintain a wall of separation from religious institutions and organizations. This is a tough nut, isn't it, Mark?
I think it's important that if the right to express oneself is something that we take seriously, we allow people to do that. Reaction doesn't necessarily make wrong. And I think in a world that's built an economy on reaction, sometimes we assume that reaction makes wrong. And I think if we say people's rights are to express themselves and to believe what they want, we should respect that. And also, secularism is a religion too. Right. And so when we talk about religions, the concept of religion and the ways we fight over it aren't going to resolve themselves. But if we're not able to be civil and find places of intersection, then we're going to have religious battles even when we're talking about not being religious. Yes,
this is a very touchy thing, as you suggest. And of course, the Supreme Court over the last couple of years has more often than not ruled in favor of these religious groups. And now that the court is what I call a Catholic Supreme Court, 6 of the justices are Roman Catholics, and they have a long-standing perception about the connection between government and religion that is is very different than many of the radical reformers, like the Baptist tradition in which I have been formed. We'll have to watch all of these. Of course, that case won't be argued until sometime next fall, and we'll report on it right here in the Meetinghouse, as you know. That's all the news, sponsored by Perfecto Coffee of California. Order some of their coffee, perfectocoffeeinc.com. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meetinghouse. I'll be back with Reverend Dr. Mark Jefferson in just a minute. Welcome back to the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm Dwight Moody, your host week by week for this 1 hour conversation. My guest today, the distinguished and scholarly Reverend Dr. Mark Jefferson. He is the assistant professor of homiletics or preaching at the Virginia Theological Seminary, just outside of Washington, D.C. I want to ask you first, as I've asked ministers for the last 15 months.
All right.
What has the pandemic done to the work and worship of the Episcopal Church?
I have a twofold answer. So
good.
I would say the first part is that the Episcopal Church in many ways has had to rethink the ways in which it's going to be present in the public space in the future. Public in terms of the international, national conversation, but even in terms of on the more concrete level, what does it mean to make community and form community in small towns, in rural parishes, in industrial, booming, corporate style church institutions, and all the places in between. So I think because of the historic foundation of the Episcopal Church and its abiding connections with the history of our country, in many ways, the Episcopal Church responds to things in ways in which become bellwether of how particular populations understand what's going on in the world. So I think technology in many ways is one of those places where the church has realized that its connection and its opportunity to be of service to the world can definitely improve. And I think I've seen responses from parishes across the country in terms of wanting to be competent in how to do that. So I see signs of hope, but I also see places where there could be some support.
Are most of the Episcopal churches open around the country?
I would say it depends on the state. So there are some states where you can gather, but they ask you to mask. There's some places that are just getting back in the swing. There's some places that are starting to. Then I think also depends upon the diocese and not just the state, but also parish to parish. Sometimes a rector could be on a 2 or 3 point rotation in which they have different parishes. So them gathering again would be different than a church in a bustling town or in a small city. So I think it all kind of depends also upon the perspective the bishop has in terms of how is that area able to respond to the health challenges that would beset particularly the Episcopal Church population.
Now, I'm broadcasting, as I told you before we went live, in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and you told me that yesterday you were in our neighbor city of Asheville, North Carolina. What brought you to Asheville?
So the second part of the first question ties into this, which is that in 2018, the dean of our seminary, the very Reverend Dr. Ian S. Markham, he invited me to preach 200 sermons leading up to and through our seminary's bicentennial, which is in 2023. So I had 5 or so or 6 kind of fiscal years to preach 200 sermons leading up. And so what that has done is become a challenge that has ignited not only our campus, but even our alums, but also pockets of the Episcopal Church because our seminary, aside from its, historic work in terms of reparations, in terms of, developing our physical plan, we're investing our resources and our energy into making sure that we benefit the Episcopal Church, particularly, and through the Episcopal Church, the church in the world. And so focusing on preaching is a priority that's been a historic consideration for us. And with the revival and the renewal of our mission, preaching has become central. So I've been going around to different parishes, different churches, and preaching for the last 2.5 years, and I'm almost at 100 sermons. So
Well,
that's why I
and
was in Asheville.
Are you coming back to Asheville to preach?
You know it. I'm coming back to
Okay.
Asheville. So I had a great conversation with Bishop McLaughlin out there, and we are looking forward to doing some deeper collaborations with our seminary in that diocese to strengthen preaching, not only in Western Carolina, but in that area.
I am the preaching minister at the Providence Baptist Church of Hendersonville, North Carolina.
Oh, wow.
So when you come down here, I want you to let me know, because I want to get together with you either on
Let's do it.
Saturday night or on Sunday afternoon. We can compare notes before we preach or after we preach.
I'll be glad to do that. Anything for you, friend.
Okay, that sounds good. You're a professor of preaching. What did you learn about preaching during the pandemic?
I learned that to preach in today's culture and times requires a profound level of humility. And those who find themselves to be self-important are going to struggle with making the transition, in part because there's so many things that fall out of our ability to stay current on because of the immediate concerns and responsibilities that many clergy have. And so many people weren't able to know what was the newest and latest doodad and gadget at Best Buy to help them to be better vloggers and webinar hosters. So seminary didn't teach them how to do these things, right? So many of the skills that they had to develop are skills that they are currently developing still. I've had people develop apps and webinars and podcasts and really utilize chaos as an opportunity to reorganize themselves and reorganize the church for effective service. And unfortunately, some churches and some rectors have tried to harken back to yesterday as a model in ways that are unhelpful and antagonistic towards growth. So I think we're at a crossroads where in the next few years, we're going to see how institutions of religious conviction consider how they're going to live in the world. And from that, we'll be able to see how it trends and what happens.
This little church where I am serving in an interim capacity, which I enjoy very much, is considering hiring a minister to their digital congregation. We've been talking about this. What a lot of churches, as you know, have discovered is that they can attract people to their services from all over the country, people who will really never, ever come into their sanctuary, but will join their worshiping, preaching, praying, testifying community online. I'm a strong believer in the power of online communities and digital communities. And I just wonder whether, the Episcopal Church, like many Baptist churches, they're so traditional in our approach to our congregations. And I just wonder whether they're going to make this pivot and see the enormous potential of the online digital community. You think that's going to happen? Are you're integrating this into your courses, I guess? As a matter of fact, are you teaching a course, or is anybody teaching a course on digital ministry at your seminary?
So I'm on sabbatical, and so what I've been doing has been to revamp my teaching load and figure out what I'm going to teach when I come back over the next 3 or 4 years, because because of the immense travel that I'm doing, I have to build out time to make sure that I write every day and do the things that I need to do otherwise. So that's one of the areas in which I'm extremely curious in terms of how do we train ministers to be more competent, to be able to communicate in the public sphere, So that's big to me, making sure that we give them the opportunity, appreciate it, to be able to have the skills. Because what I'm realizing is that the inability to have a consistent and professional and thoughtful presence in the public sphere hurts any type of ability to be able to communicate the gospel effectively.
Right.
And I know that's one of the areas in which our seminary is wrestling with. We're a residential seminary. We live on the campus, but how do we still train people to be able to communicate digitally in the 21st century, though we are residential at our core? So I think we're at a place where we're all wrestling with how to do that. But hopefully I'll be able to have something for that in the springtime.
I hope so too. And I'm serving as a consultant to this little congregation where I am about this. And we have located and have registered for an online conference on the church and digital media next Thursday, right? During this, I don't know why they had the audacity to schedule this thing right during the Meetinghouse. I'm going to have to check into that. They're not evidently attuned to what's really going on out there in digital land, but my hope is,
Dwight, I also say this: one of the things that helped me to have a perspective on the importance of media and ministry is my time in seminary. When I was in seminary, I worked at a church at that time called the Greater Travelers Rest Baptist Church. Now it's called the House of Hope Atlanta. And at that time, I was the director of Christian education. So this was 2006 to 2008-09. And so during that time, we were streaming on Streaming Faith. During that time, we were having online Bible studies. During that time, we were doing online membership. So being with pastors like Dr. Smith and seeing digital mechanisms employed early, in many ways, geared my mind to make sense of how to navigate these times. So it wasn't my first rodeo preaching to a camera setup and having to interact in ways that seemed to be unnatural. So having that practice did me a lot of good and opened me up to hopefully help people think not only about the mechanics of it in terms of how to set it up, or recommend people to do that type of work in terms of arranging the audio visual, but even thinking theologically about what it means to incorporate these things in worship. What does it mean to preach knowing that the world is listening to you, though you're talking to 15 people? These are things that I'm realizing more preachers would like more development and discussion about. And I realize that the pandemic has been a time for all of us to think about how do we answer some of those questions.
You were with us a decade or more ago when we launched the Academy of Preachers. When one of the things we did, they were good times, transformational times, inspirational times. I can't tell you how many times people said to me, I wish there had been something like this when I was a young preacher. I heard it yesterday. I was the guest preacher on a radio-only worship service.
Okay.
And it was just audio, and there was a pretty detailed order of worship, and I was the preacher of record. I preached a 15-minute sermon, but there were people I don't know how many states who were participating in this audio worship service. I found it very inspirational. But when we started the AOP, we videotaped every sermon and put it up on YouTube. You could go to the AOP website now. There are thousands of these sermons, YouTube sermons. A couple of them mine. Hundreds of them belong to these young preachers. Some of them belong to your mentors down there at Emory Divinity School. But we started very early using the digital means to inspire the young people, to train the young people, encourage them to go back and listen to themselves. Mark, I have taught preaching for a number of years myself, and I'm of the opinion that, the number one thing that people ought to do is just go back and listen and watch themselves preach. This is one of the great learning.
It's painful.
It's painful.
Yeah, it's painful. A lot of people don't want to go through the pain of self-reflection. This is what I tell ministers when they ask me to do, private consultations. If you're not willing to face yourself, you won't know who the congregation is facing every week.
That's right. You're exactly right.
So that benign neglect of self-awareness doesn't make anybody better. If anything, it slows down the possibility to be a better preacher, because that's a blind spot that we're not willing to face. So hopefully people will be more attentive to that.
From time to time, we have one of these young preachers who are now in their 30s and even in their 40s who will call me or write me and said, please take down my sermon off the YouTube. And we always do this, if they ask us, they're trying to get a church, maybe a call. They don't want their search committee or the bishop to find a 12-year-old sermon when they were just starting. And as a matter of fact, I had one student from another country, one of the most brilliant students we had in 10 years of AOP, who wrote me and said, you have to take my name off of the website, every reference to it, including the sermons, because if my hierarchy finds out that I have been associating in an ecumenical environment, I'll be blacklisted the rest of my life. Interesting.
That's part of the consideration that comes with now preaching in a multimodal, technologically driven, hyper-connected reality, whereby the past, the present, and the future are all merged together into the present. And that immediate present creates opportunities for us to face ourselves and also to be ashamed and to also reflect upon our current choices. And so we're all living into the digital age, and hopefully we're doing the best we can to make smart choices, because the world that we grew up in is not the world that we're in.
We have to be a lot more careful what we say. We can't just spout off we have to be a lot more careful.
I just tell people, mean what you say. Some things people say because they don't mean it. And so again, somebody having a reaction to what you're saying, a reaction is natural. So a reaction is one thing, but do the best you can to be as knowledgeable and aware about things as you can be. And so that if you were mistaken, you can own being mistaken. But the ways in which this world tries to shun accountability and responsibility for the ways in which we live, I think, hurts the spoken word, and it hurts the means in which we do our craft. So the only way to really recapture that in ways that are meaningful is to take accountability for our ever evolving and changing perspectives. And so sometimes that's part of it, being able to say, look, I'm trying to navigate the larger digital world, so this might hinder me from doing that. So that's how it goes.
I want to talk a little bit about the future of the Episcopal Church. I don't know whether you were at you may have been at the 2016 National Festival of Young Preachers in Lexington, Kentucky, when your presiding bishop, Michael Curry, came to preach. Were you there that year?
Yes, sir, I was there.
I have
on my Facebook page is our picture.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Well, from that day, if you look on my Facebook page, that's my picture.
I have seen it. I remember vividly his sermon, "The Dream of God," and of course, he brought with him his assistant, Stephanie Spellers. You know Stephanie, I'm sure. Well,
I've heard her name. I haven't had the chance to interact with her.
Well, she was my guest in the Meetinghouse maybe 2 months ago, talking about her book, The Church Cracked Open. I read and reviewed the book. It's my review is on my website at themeetinghouse.net. She's a very engaging, articulate, and compelling witness to Jesus, to the resurrection, to the vibrancy of faith in the modern world. I hope you can get to know her, bring her down to your seminary. She's good. But let's go back to the future of the Episcopal Church. I think I sent you an article. Did I send you that? Okay, Ryan Burge, who was my guest in the Meetinghouse maybe 4 months ago, is a Baptist pastor out in Mount Vernon, Illinois, and a professor at Eastern Illinois University. And he writes a blog and does research on religion and American life. And he's the one that wrote the book, The Nones, Nones. So yesterday he came out with this article, pretty bold statement saying the Episcopal Church cannot survive. What do you think?
I would say that his attention to the statistics is extremely helpful in terms of painting the accurate assessment of what would happen if things continue to trend in their current direction. But one of the things that I take, one of the things that motivates me to be my best every day is to know that people are saying that something I'm a part of is going to die.
Yeah, I agree.
And although I'm not Episcopalian, my job is to serve the church through the Episcopal Church.
Amen.
And I take my craft and my profession seriously. So the athletic competitor in me is stirred to make sure that I do what I can do to strengthen Episcopal preaching, particularly through our denomination, and doing a great job through my denomination and cultivating scholarship that does that. We can influence the immediate church and the broad church. So I take it as an opportunity to, it's like black cloth to a diamond. So you need the black cloth to set the distinction. So for me, it's just an opportunity to see what our institution is willing to do and how we're going to creatively and compellingly engage the present age. And so I don't get in fights to lose. So I'm just excited to see what opportunities are available for us to strengthen preaching.
Well, this little church where I am, Providence Baptist Church, a wonderful congregation of people, but very small and very nervous about their own future. They had a meeting their leadership did last night, wrestling with the questions of what to do and where to go and how to do it. A member of the church is an architect. I want to tell you this story. In a conversation with me about a month ago, he said, I work for a regional architectural firm that has offices up and down the eastern seaboard. He said, I work in what's known as their church studio, meaning that there's a group of these architects who focus mainly on the needs of churches, not only building design, repurposing buildings, digital and equipment and all that sort of thing. This is what he said to me. He said, over the last 3 or 4 years, almost all of our work as consultants has been to help megachurches offload property and downsize their campus. You know, it's not just the small, struggling churches. They're having to retool for the new age of American religious life.
I grew up in an interesting constellation of churches. So my grandfather was a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church tradition. And so his church was a moderate size, middle to upper middle class African-American congregation. My grandmother, on the other hand, she went to a church called Rock Church, which is in Virginia Beach, which is a significant church in the Pentecostal charismatic world. That's where I saw T.D. Jakes. That's where I saw, all the big charismatic figures. And so growing up in one church space, which is a little more like the traditional space, and then also growing up in a 5,000 or so, rollicking Pentecostal megachurch, I understand the ways in which people develop religious meaning. But what is interesting to note is that our religious life and our economic, social life are all connected, and we don't make these connections. As inflation continues to rise, our churches get smaller in terms of size because the dollar doesn't go as far. The things that sustain our religious life are not able to sustain us in the same way. So the boom of the 90s has now met, the rapid inflation of 2021. And so now these congregations in these denominations are having to ask bigger questions about how are we going to relate what it means to be church in a world that doesn't need us to hold physical space in the ways of the past in order to be church. So I think it presents us an interesting dichotomy for small and big churches alike to wrestle with.
I agree with that. I was talking with a church consultant just this last week, not this week, but last week, from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we had a long conversation about this. He's working with several churches that are trying to decide whether to keep their doors open or sell their property and look for a different way to be church. And he asked me this question. He said, Dwight, have you heard about the micro church? Micro church. Well, I had to say no, at least not under that rubric, but I can pretty well guess what it is, and kind of a counterbalance to this wave of megachurches over the last 30 years that have dominated not just evangelical church life, but in many cases mainline. Lutherans have had some large churches.
Mega is synonymous with the American way.
It is.
And so as we come to reckon with the cost of mega, the realities that mega bring, and then the entailments that come from embracing mega lives, mega has come to define, a generation or two of thought. And now we're living post-mega. And I think post-mega requires Christians to be more personally accountable for their faith.
Yeah.
And the story of Jesus will go on. The concept of the mega church will come and go. So hopefully we haven't clung to the dust of this world too tightly.
I have a friend who's been a member of one of the largest mega churches in the United States. And she said to me a few years ago, I'm tired of the big church. I just want a place that knows my name and will bring me a casserole when I'm sick. I loved it. I should write an article on that. You are listening to The Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody, coming to you over Rejoice Radio in the Golden Isles of Georgia and through the television network of St. Stephen's Baptist Church of Louisville, Kentucky. My guest has been the Reverend Dr. Mark Jefferson, professor of preaching, or homiletics as we call it, at the Virginia Theological Seminary. Thank you for being in the Meetinghouse today, Mark.
Dr. Dwight, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for all your contributions to strengthening conversations in the public square. I love you much, my friend. Please take care of yourself, and I look forward to talking to you next time I'm in Asheville so we can get together and swap them notes.
Yes, sir. You need to send me your mailing address, even if it's the seminary, so I can send you some coffee. And you let me know when you're coming to Asheville.
I love it.
I'm not going to tell my congregation you're coming because they would all abandon me and go over there to hear you preach. But I'll tell them after you preach. God's blessings to you. I'll be back in just a minute.
Likewise, friend. Take care.
Okay, with my commentary entitled, Yes, I'm Woke. Yes, I'm woke, and I'm proud of it, and embarrassed at the same time. But mostly, I don't see what all the fuss is. I don't understand why there's such resistance to being awakened to a history that has been hidden from so many of us for so long. Here is what I mean by being woke. I have been awakened to a history, mostly Black history, that I never knew. I've been awakened to Black voices that I've never heard. I have been awakened to the systemic ways white America has marginalized Black America and continues to do so to this very day. I don't understand why this is so terrible, according to some people. Why is it being denounced as anti-American and anti-Christian? Why is it a threat to anybody, anywhere? A few years ago, I found myself in Galveston, Texas. My son was living there and I was visiting him. While there, I read in the local newspapers about the traditional reenactment of a supposedly famous event that occurred in June of 1865, 2 months after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox to end the Civil War. They called this celebration Juneteenth. I had never heard of it. I had successfully completed 24 years of education, 24 years, and had never heard of Juneteenth. At least I have no memory of it. With a few hundred people, I attended the commemorative service at the AME Church on Broadway, a sanctuary, a congregation known as Reedy Chapel. I sat on the back row in front of what turned out to be the color guard. There were 6 men dressed in Civil War era Union uniforms, blue. Later, they led the parade to the courthouse. There was, in the service in the church, there was music, drumming, and singing, and there were speeches. I even think there was some dancing. Then we gathered outside in the slightest of rain to walk the half-dozen blocks to a site near the original courthouse where what is known as General Order Number 3 was read. It was all new to me, as was the news of the Tulsa Race Massacre. A friend of mine sent me 4 books and a paper he wrote. And a pastor friend in Tulsa sent me a link to his interview with the chairman of that centennial commemoration. I later learned from a map posted on Facebook that such massacres happened in cities across the country, mobs of white people killing scores of Black people. I had never heard of it. Along the way, I read some books. The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, by a scholar named Edward E. Baptist. Good name. Another book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, by what I think is a husband-wife team, William A. Darity Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen at, I believe, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And then that best-selling book by Isabel Wilkerson, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. I reread Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I had not read in decades. I read its companion volume, The Road to Dawn, Josiah Henson and the story that sparked the Civil War. I was interested in it because Josiah Henson was a slave in Owensboro, Kentucky, where my dad is from, where I was a pastor, where I'm going to preach in just a few weeks. And it was his story of escaping from slavery that inspired the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe's book. On my table beside my bed are these books, The Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America by Michael Eric Dyson. The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. They're making a movie out of that. The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, which Isabel Wilkerson wrote before she wrote the book Caste. Why is this reading and learning such a threat to people? Why is educating ourselves to the history of our country so denounced by people? I'm not the only one on this journey. Take, for instance, Ty Sedul, Professor Emeritus of History at West Point. Read his book. I did, and reviewed it. It's called Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause. His journey parallels mine. You can read my review of it at themeetinghouse.net. The answer might lie in the phrase systemic racism, the idea that public policies have been framed and enforced that advantage white people and disadvantage Black people. This reality and its multi-layered evidence challenges the the notion that sin and wickedness are simply the attitudes and actions of individuals. It reinforces the notion, the biblical notion, that wickedness permeates our culture in ways that are longer, wider, deeper than the unrighteousness of any one person. It makes all of us culpable to things that cannot be traced to one individual. Thousands of us, even millions of us, have been awakened to these realities about our country. Histories are being rewritten, museums are opening, courses are being taught, minds are being changed, laws are being challenged, people are being awakened to things we have never seen, never heard, never known. Perhaps you are awakening to this new world. It is an awakening, a renaissance, a revival of truth and justice. So I want to say I am woke, as they say, and proud of it, but embarrassed more than I can say that it took so long, that I waited so late, that I am left with so little time to think, to write, to preach, to lead. All I can say, all I can quote are the words of Jesus. Help me, Lord, for the night comes when no man can work. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meetinghouse, and I'll be back in just a minute. You're in the Meetinghouse. You've been in the Meetinghouse for the last 55 minutes with me, your host, Dwight A. Moody. I encourage you to visit my website, themeetinghouse.net. Read all the commentaries, or some of them at least, and some of the book reviews, including my new book review of this book, Fault Lines. You don't need to buy the book. I encourage you to join our Circle of 70. This is a fundraising initiative that I launched last year when I was 70 years old. These are people who believe in what we're doing. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe you're listening today, or maybe you read each week. We need your support. For the first 6 months of this year, we set a budget goal of $20,000. We raised just shy of $22,000. And I'm grateful, I'm thrilled that we've met all of our expenses. And we have set a goal for the next 6 months of $24,000. And I'm asking you to make a gift. We had 28 donors in the first 6 months. I hope all 28 of those donors will give again. Maybe you're one of them. But I hope we can find another 28 or more that would give us 70, what we call the Circle of 70. You can go to themeetinghouse.net/support for directions on how you can give. I announced at the beginning of the class that this coming Monday night, I'm going to teach my class, but then I'm going to suspend it due to some health issues that I've been having. So don't register for that, as I've been appealing. You can go to our website at the podcast and listen to all of our shows, including this one. It'll be up and ready later tonight. I want to thank my engineer, Everett Armstrong, down there in the Golden Isles of Georgia, and Alex Mattingly in Kentucky, the Bluegrass State. Thank all of you for listening. Thank you for your interest. Follow me on Twitter at Dwight A. Moody. I'm up to 418, making progress. But until next week, be safe, do justice, love mercy, get a vaccine, drink some coffee, order some Perfecto coffee, send a donation to the Meetinghouse. If you have discerned what my health issue is, send me an email or a phone call or a text. And if you're right, I'll send you some coffee. I encourage you to pray for the soul of America. Be kind to everyone. You know, the gospel tells us, be ye kind one to another. Just about the first verse of scripture any of us learned. Let God fill your heart with gratitude. Thank you for listening. In the Meeting House, I'm Dwight A. Moody. Have a great day.
You have been in the Meeting House with host Dwight A. Moody. Thank you for watching or listening today. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net for more news, reviews, commentaries, and conversation on religion and American life.